Good evening, church. I appreciate everyone's patience with me this morning. I know I talked for a little bit longer than I don't know, perhaps was wise. We'll see. This evening, you'll be happy to know I plan on talking not as long. Um, Maybe disappointed to know that that doesn't always come to pass. Um, so, if you want to turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 7, that's where we're going to be this evening. Is Mark chapter 7. I do not plan on turning anywhere else as of right now. So we'll be in Mark chapter 7 and we'll stay there. Um, Sometimes when I'm given the opportunity to preach, I immediately know what I want to talk about. I immediately I'm just set. I'm like, yep, I've been thinking about this for quite a while. Um, this morning's sermon was one of those sermons where uh, I'd been thinking about that one for a while. Just observations that I'd seen, and then I had settled in my mind what I was going to preach on this evening and this afternoon as I was preparing and reviewing what I was going to do. I thought to myself, I want to go a different direction. And so we talked a little bit this morning, or talked a lot about, I guess, one of the Ten Commandments. And in Mark chapter 7, we're going to run into another one of these commandments, and it's going to come in the context of a conversation that Jesus has with some Pharisees and scribes who are uh, displeased with what they see in Jesus and those who are following him. And it is this very interesting conversation that they have, and I think it's interesting for several reasons. Um, and Hopefully, you'll find them interesting, like I did. And so we're going to go ahead and begin in Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. And it says, "Now, when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the traditions of the elders. And when they come from their marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, 'Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?' And he said to them, 'Well did Isaiah prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men.'" This is the beginning. His initial response. I like to look at it in terms of like a warning shot, a shot across the bow of the ship, saying, "Hey, you've asked me a question. You're going to regret asking me this question because the answer I'm going to give you is not something that is going to please you. You come to me and ask a question about my followers, and you're expecting a 'I've got you' kind of moment." And Jesus turns around and gives them a warning. He says, "Look, well did Isaiah prophesy of you that you're hypocrites, that you honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." We discussed this morning how some of these traditions that have built up based upon commandments that were given to the Israelites uh, perhaps can come from a good place. right? When discussing the idea of using the Lord's name in vain, we talked about how a tradition arose within the Israelite people to where they were so concerned about making sure that they did not use the Lord's name in vain that they would change the writing utensil that they used whenever they were uh, copying the text. That they would, instead of writing out the whole word, just use certain letters. That they would, in fact, often over time, it became obvious that the Israelites, they wouldn't even say the Yahweh, they would use Adonai and these other terms for the Lord. They would use other things, all in an attempt to make sure that they did their best to not use the Lord's name in vain. And like I said, from the perspective of someone who has grown up in a culture that uses the Lord's name in the most flippant, ridiculous ways, I can respect a tradition that says, you know what, if we're gonna go one way or the other, we're gonna go towards the let's really make sure we don't do it route. And they built up this tradition that went into it. But one of the things that happened over time is that it's not just that tradition that gets built up. That there's all sorts of traditions that the Israelites built up to, I suppose, attempt to help people follow God. All right, I have to assume that most of the traditions that Jesus deals with, and this isn't the only time that he's going to deal with this concept of here's a tradition that you teach, and here's why you've gone too far in the way that you handle this tradition, right? But that I have to assume that the beginning of these traditions was well intentioned. Right? I really doubt that there were, this tradition built up over the idea of making sure that you have washed your hands, and we're not talking about like when we send our children to wash their hands after they've been playing outside, right? It's not a hey, it's dinner time. You've been outside in the dirt. You've been running around with all sorts of nasty things. It's time to clean up and wash our hands so we don't get sick. It's not that kind of washing, right? It is a ceremonial washing. It is a washing that is done uh, as part of this idea of making sure we avoid unclean things. Right? I don't know who touched that thing. Whoever touched that thing might be unclean. Therefore, I'm going to do the best I can to make sure that I'm not dirtied by the unclean. Right? And they built this tradition up, and what is interesting here is apparently, right? We Jesus doesn't say you don't know what you're talking about. My disciples do the washing, right? They follow the traditions. You're wrong, right? That's not his response. So evidently, his followers are not, at least at this instance, following this tradition. Right? We have no reason to believe that the Pharisees and the scribes are lying to Jesus when they say, hey, look, we've noticed that your followers aren't doing this. What's up? How come they're not doing that? They're not doing the thing that everyone else is doing. This tradition that's been handed down to us from our elders, they're not doing it. Why aren't they doing it? And Jesus is using it as an opportunity to teach them, to get them to understand how sometimes even well-intentioned traditions can become stumbling blocks to following the clear commands that God has given us. And so he starts off with, like I said, what I call like the warning shot. If you've ever seen, um, you know, or maybe you were like me. I When I was younger, I did not get into very many physical altercations. I know, looking at me, hard to believe I didn't want to pick fights with a bunch of people, right? Always been on the shorter, slightly more rotund side of things. Physical combat was not my prowess. I didn't take karate, I didn't do boxing, but I was pretty quick with a word. right? And when I was younger, we would have these conversations every once in a while amongst my group of friends. And one of them would say something that I felt just needed to be mocked. And I would make some type of comment, and all the other friends would know that kid's about to get it. He's about to be embarrassed because Ryan's going to mock him and probably not let it down for a while. Not defending the behavior. I want to be clear. I'm not telling you guys go out and mock your friends, especially you younger ones. It's not. I'm not proud of it in the sense of, man, it was a really cool thing of me to do, but it was what I was known for doing. I had the ability to stir the pot a little bit. Right. My parents were here this weekend, and we were talking about some of my childhood friends. And my mom said, "I don't remember you ever getting in fights, but your friends sure got in a lot of fights." And I told her a lot of those fights started because I said something to one of them that got the other one mad at the other one. And it just a habit I had. But people knew it was coming. It wasn't a surprise. It wasn't shock. No one was surprised whenever I would open my mouth and I was going to say something that mocked them. Jesus here says, "Hey, Pharisees, scribes, watch out." Right? I mean, he's already laid into them a little bit. He says, "Look, you're hypocrites. You've established yourselves as people who do not actually honor God, but you try to present yourself as people who honor God. You present yourself as someone who is very adamant about their faith and adamant about doing what is right, and yet Jesus says you fall short of what you're supposed to do." He continues in verse 9, and he said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition." You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. When confronted by these men about why do his followers not follow the traditions that the elders follow, that according to Mark, all of the Pharisees, all of the Jews did these things. Why aren't your people following this tradition? Jesus says, look, you have a way of making traditions that get in the way of following the commandments. And he's going to give them a clear example. In verse 10, for Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. We're going to pause there real quick for what I felt was an interesting observation that I had when I was discussing this with the teenagers not all that long ago, as the Sunday morning group was going through the Ten Commandments. I was looking at this, and this is one of those commandments: honor your father and mother. That for me, in my Christian faith, I have always associated it with when you're a kid. And for some reason, reading it this last time, looking at the times that it's used in the New Testament, I came to the realization that I hadn't really come to before, and I don't know why I hadn't come to it before, but I came to the realization that the vast majority of the audience that is told to honor their mother and father are not children. Right? The original command, and this is not to say, by the way, kids, pay attention real quick if you're not paying attention at all. I am not telling you that you don't have to honor your mother and father. You're supposed to. New Testament's very clear about, the Bible's very clear about that. Honor your mother and father, right? Also give some instructions to parents about how to make that a little bit easier of a job for your children. Your children should not have a hard time honoring you, right? But the command to honor your mother and father is not primarily directed at children. When Jesus is discussing it here, he's not talking to the Pharisees' kids. It's not like the Pharisees and the scribes dragged their kids with them for this confrontation with Jesus and said, watch it. And Jesus was like, kids, you're supposed to honor him. No, he is talking to adults. He's telling adults, you're supposed to honor your mother and father. You're supposed to keep the commandments. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, we're going to get a hint here about one of the things that it's supposed to mean that the people Jesus is talking to have failed to live up to. One of the ways in which adults are supposed to honor their mother and father is that when their mother and father become elderly and become old and become to the point where they need assistance in all of the things that come to their lives, that the children make sure that their parents have what their parents need. And yet, this is the issue that they come to. Verse 11, but you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is korban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and there are many such things you do. You see, Jesus uses this example of honor your mother and father and this tradition that had been built up over time, this tradition that taught that if you take the money, the things that you ought to have in order to be able to take care of your parents when they need the assistance, as part of honoring them the way in which God commanded them, you have been taught through your tradition that as long as you say, those funds that I would have used for that, I am going to give to the temple, I am going to give to God, parents can fend for themselves. That they have no expectation of you as their child, honoring them by making sure that they are taken care of when they need help. You see, the Israelites built up a tradition that directly contradicted the commands of God. God gives a simple command: honor your mother and father. And over time, people take the simple command to honor your mother and father and they build these traditions around it that get so out of hand that followers of God are taught as long as you commit that to God, you don't have to do what God said you're supposed to do. When we think about that, it's an interesting thing to me to think about that in terms of what that would look like. And there's a lot of things about this response that I find interesting. One of them is uh, I don't think Jesus' response to the Pharisees and scribes necessarily condemns the practice of doing the ceremonial washing, right? As I read this, right, Jesus doesn't necessarily say, hey, this ceremonial washing thing that you guys have built as a tradition is a terrible thing, don't do it. It seems to me, and I can be wrong, willing to be wrong, I'm willing to be corrected, right? But it seems to me that Jesus' response here neither supports nor condemns that practice of a traditional washing, right? It seems to me that Jesus doesn't say that the traditional washing is in and of itself something that is definitely wrong, but by his disciples, his followers not practicing it, it seems to me that Jesus is saying at the very least it's not necessary. Right, but I think we can understand the difference between traditions that are wrong and traditions that are perhaps unnecessary but not wrong in themselves. Right, like we have certain traditions that we practice as a congregation that I think would fit more into the category of, you know, not wrong, not right type of thing, right? We have a traditional structure to our worship in regards to, when we take Lord's communion, when we take the Lord's Supper, right? Normally, not always, normally, before the sermon, right? So much so that if you're like me, sometimes you get really confused, right? I get confused on the Sundays when John gets up there and starts talking, and I'm like, wait a second, we forgot something, right? I mean, that's a tradition thing, right? But where that could become wrong, right? Like what if you establish as a tradition something along the lines of saying, you know what, we're not going to take the Lord's Supper this Sunday because we really want to focus on what John has to say or what Ryan has to say in the morning. Well, that would be something if we turn that into a tradition that's clearly violating the teachings of God, right? And so I just want us to be aware and to consider these things and to think about it in our lives. Like, we recognize that there are things that are traditions that are not in and of themselves necessarily right or wrong. Right? I personally enjoy having a familiar structure to coming and worshiping. It helps me be able to anticipate what is going on so that I can be more focused, so that I can, especially with little ones, and all of you with little ones who have had little ones, you understand what I mean. How are we going to navigate this next little section of worship in the way that is the most beneficial for everyone? Right? It helps us. So I enjoy that, but also I don't get worked up when we change that. Right? I don't know, those of you who've been attending here at Oak Hill for a long time, we're used to having Bible class after worship. I'll be honest with you, that really threw me off when we first came here, right? Man, I grew up going our Bible class, then worship. That's how it was done, right? And it threw me off that we didn't flip it. That's weird. But that's one of those tradition things, right? When I go back to Kansas and visit, and I'm there on a Sunday morning, it doesn't affect me to go to Bible class for these again traditions, neither good nor bad. But we need to recognize that it is possible for us, just as it was possible for the Israelites, to build up traditions that get in the way of doing what we're supposed to be doing. That we can build up traditions that make it difficult to follow out the commandments that were given in the Bible. And Jesus here uses this as an example again, this idea of honoring your mother and father, and how the traditions that were taught to these people like directly contradicted what they're supposed to do. And Jesus says, "Look, you do this, and this is terrible. This is awful." Right? You wanna come to me and talk to me about this ceremonial washing of hands tradition, and yet you have these traditions that contradict the command of God, that you put more effort, more concern into whether or not my followers are following this man made tradition than you do about whether or not the followers of God, the people of Israel, are taught the correct commands? Says your priorities get messed up. And so, what I want to challenge us tonight with is not challenge any of our traditions for the sake of challenging traditions, but challenge us to think, hey, am I making sure that the traditions that I have built up through my life in regards to what it means to follow God, are they traditions that help me follow the commandments of God? Are there traditions that hinder me from following the commandments of God? And how do I handle these traditions when I come into contact with with Christians who have other traditions? Right? What do I do when I go to a congregation that uh, the way in which they you know partake of communion is they pass out the little plastic cup with the you know you pull the thing over and you get the styrofoam thing, like the styrofoam bread and all that. Like what I've run into people who those type of differences cause them so much agony. And I wonder to myself, have they built up a tradition about how they get the bread that is so strong in them that it prevents them from really recognizing what they're supposed to be focusing on when they partake of the bread? That's something that we as Christians ought to be careful about. Because again, I just can't imagine that that tradition of saying as long as you have committed this money to God, you don't have to worry about committing it to your parents. I can't imagine that that was started with like horrible intent, right? Like I don't know exactly. I didn't look into it as far as the exact timing of when that type of tradition started and all the circumstances that went into it. But I imagine that that type of tradition starts with the idea of, hey, we're giving to God here. As long as we're giving to God, right? That's better than this, right? And you can make a certain amount of sense out of that, right? Yeah, I recognize that maybe my parents get cold in the winter. Maybe they're struggling with this. Maybe they're struggling with being able to get to doctor's appointments that they need to get to, or whatever it might be that we as their children can help them with. But I could pay for this service to help them with that, but I've committed that to making sure that there's a missionary going out somewhere else. And again, the question that comes to my mind is this, right? Because obviously it would not be wrong for me to give money to a missionary who is out there preaching and spreading the gospel, right? But if in my efforts to give that money to that missionary, I don't take care of the things God has commanded me to do, like honor my mother and father, I don't know that I'm in the right. Right? But you can see how these type of traditions might build up. And so again, my encouragement tonight is not throw away all the traditions that we have. Right? My encouragement tonight, as far as being Christian and understanding, kind of what message does this passage point out to me? What do I think about when I read this passage? What I think about is I want to make sure that I am prepared to recognize the difference between traditions and commands, right? If someone asks me, again, using the example of taking the Lord's Supper, if someone asks me, why do you take the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week? My answer is never, well, traditionally, da 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 da. My answer is always, well, because it is the pattern that we see in the New Testament church. And we strive to fulfill that pattern, right? I don't think we partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week because it's a tradition that is a good tradition. At least we shouldn't be doing it because it's a tradition, it's a good tradition. We should be doing it because it's a commandment of God. Right? And again, recognize the difference between tradition and commandment. How many songs do we sing before we take the Lord's Supper? It's tradition. Do we sing a song after service? Like after the sermon, do we sing a song in order to give people an opportunity to come forward if they have a need? Tradition. Do we gather inside a building like this? Or do we meet elsewhere? Tradition. And we have to, we ought to, as Christians, be mindful of those things. Because how scary of a thought is it that sometimes we allow traditions to get in the way of having proper brotherhood with fellow Christians whose traditions differ than ours. I grew up in a congregation that around Christmas time had a big struggle with some members of the congregation wanting to make sure, or feeling very uncomfortable, let's put it this way, very uncomfortable with, uh, as a congregation, singing any hymns that had anything to do with Jesus being born around Christmas. These very same individuals would have no issue if you sang it in July. They'd probably enjoy it a lot. But if it was in December, no, we don't sing Christmas songs in this church. I look at that and I say, well, that's kind of a tradition thing, right? Now, and I agree with, I think that the way that our congregation handled it was wise. I appreciated the elders' wisdom in that, and the elders said, look, if this is going to make some of our members uncomfortable, and we know it's going to make them uncomfortable, we're going to go ahead and ask that those who are selecting songs avoid these songs during this time because we're not it's not worth this conflict over these things. I appreciated it, but at the same time I can recognize that, look, there's something kind of silly about someone allowing a tradition type of thing to separate them from brothers and sisters in Christ. Right? And here Jesus hammers these Pharisees and these scribes and says, look, man, you've got these traditions all over the place, that these traditions make it to where you contradict the commands of God. And so we also ought to examine ourselves and make sure, hey, are the things that we do that are done out of a tradition, are they things that hinder us from following the commandments of God? I hope not. This is one of the things that I don't know what the answer to this is. And it's something I also have struggled with in my life. And so I'm not saying this as an attack on anyone or attack on the congregation or anything like that. But one of the things that I've always struggled with growing up in the church is when I read the book of Acts and the letters that are written to Timothy about the way that the church helped each other. And for the most part in my life, I've been a part of congregations where everyone is really, really willing to help. And I want to be clear, I think the Oak Hill congregation is very, very much willing to help people. But one of the things that seems to be a tradition, at least in my lifetime, is Christians being afraid to ask other Christians for help. It's this weird tradition we have where the front pew is left empty for anyone who needs to come forward. And we ourselves, if someone comes forward and sits in that front pew and asks for prayers or asks for help, we are glad that someone did so. But we also go, that would not be me. I'm not going to, I'm not going forward. And that, to me, I mean, I don't know what else to call it. Maybe tradition's not the right word, but I don't know what else to call it. Where there is a tradition that has been developed, and like I said, the front pew's empty. It's empty tonight. It's here. It's ready tonight. And we're going to have an opportunity in just a moment to where if you have a prayer request, you have a need, that you can come forward and share it with the church so that the church can help you out. And like I said, I say this as someone who I can think of many, many times in my life where I ought to have been in that pew, asking the church to encourage me to be better, asking the church to help me get through my struggles when people I loved were sick and were ill. And I didn't do it because I didn't want to be a burden to other people in the congregation. One of the things that we see, the patterns we see in the New Testament, is the church being there for one another. And so I guess as I close this up, I hope that you've looked at this and thought, hey, that's an interesting passage. I hope you've thought about this idea of honoring your mother and father as more of a command to us as adults than just children. I've hoped that it challenges you to think of the traditions that we have and to examine them. But more than anything, I hope that I can challenge us as a congregation, us as Christians, to reflect what we see in the New Testament of a church that is willing to share our burdens so that other Christians can help us lift them. It is hard for our brothers and sisters in Christ to help us when they don't know that we have a need. And so I want to encourage you tonight, if there is a need, that we have a tradition, that a song will be sang. And during the singing of that song, you will have the opportunity to come forward and to request prayers, to request assistance. And understand that that is not a thing that anyone in this congregation is going to look at and go, wow, that fool. Why would they do that? But also, if you're like me, you're probably thinking, I'm not going up. But let's use the traditions that we do have that can encourage us to follow God